So redistricting, when? When do we do this? Well, we do this every 10 years because people move around, and, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So the easy way to remember that is the years ending in 1 is that's when we do redistricting, because the census is taken in zeros, in years ending in zeros. So that's an easy way to remember it, right? Okay, so why? I'm going to show you, can you do that first? Yeah, I've got a colleague over there who's going to pull up this wonderful interactive map that's available on the Minnesota website. I can send it out to everybody if you like. This shows why we have to do redistricting, because people don't stay still and have exactly a replication number of kids so that the population remains in the same place. You can see that, oh, here's my little thingy, yeah, all right. So in Wright County, since 1960, the population has grown, okay? So show us one where it has, see how those lines were changing? Now here's a county, Wilkin County, right? Anybody live in Wilkin County? No? Okay. Well, in Wilkin County, apparently people have been leaving. I'm so sorry, you know. I'm sure it's a wonderful place. Property values might be, reasonable. Invest in real estate there. But you can see that people have reduced, the population has gone down there. So if you kept exactly the same representatives coming from the same place indefinitely, which used to be the case, I think we have maybe part of our panel, yes? Yay! Then what would happen is that the representation would change, right? So if I say these 3 people can have 1 representative, and all of those people have 1 representative, who has better representation? That's right, because they have, 1/3 of their representatives, and y'all have some other number out there. I don't know what that number would be. We'd have to draw new lines, to make it more fair, to have 1 person, 1 vote. That's what you're supposed to say out there. So, all right, so let's go back to that slide. Yes, okay. So, ta-da. So we need geographic representation. So one way we think about this is that the whole state has to be covered by representatives, all right? So we have a boundary of the state of Minnesota. Got that? We need population representative. The boundary of the state of Minnesota, they stay the same, but the people move around. So if we're going to represent the population, the lines are going to move around. And we have this principle of, 1 person, 1 vote. The Supreme Court is kind of picky about that. Now, it's not perfect. It's not down to the but approximately 1 person, 1 vote. Okay, certainly better than 3 persons here and everybody else there. Okay. Now, we're getting into interesting territory here. So maybe competitive elections. How many of you think that you should have competitive elections, that is to say, a couple of candidates at least, that either of whom has a chance to win in case you want to vote for them? Nice, okay. Hold that thought. So competitive elections, so you get choices, but in the end, some candidate is going to have, if not a majority, maybe at least a plurality. That is to say, more votes than the competitors, okay? So we have the system that works that way, okay? But another thing you might want to think about when it comes to having goals for redistricting is to strengthen your party's majority. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so drawing new lines. So what is redistricting? It's drawing new lines to make all those other things happen. Drawing new lines for the congressional districts, there are 8 of them in this state. Drawing new lines for the Senate districts, 67. And Amaze Your Friends, drawing new lines for the legislative districts, 134 for the House. It's double the Senate because each Senate district gets halved. So amaze your friends with all this detail. Okay, so who does this? Redistricting, who does it? Legislative committees do it, right? And there's a subcommittee on redistricting, consists of 4 members, appointed by the Legislative Coordinating Commission. And of course, because it's from the legislature, the legislature has to approve a plan. But the governor is also part of this process and can veto it or not. Now, if you have a Democratic governor or Republican, and you have a legislative majority of the other, what problem might you run into? And we have and will, all right? So if they can't get it done, then the courts do it. Got that? All right. That's Minnesota, by the way. Every state does it a little bit differently. Okay, so here we get to the court's principles and some important official kinds of principles. I could put you in small groups and have you come up with principles. That would make a much longer session today, so I won't do that, okay? I'm supposed to be modeling brief here, so one principle is that we have to abide by the U.S. Constitution. We agreed to do that, the people who made Minnesota a state agreed to abide by the U.S. Constitution and the statutes pursuant thereto, which means, the Voting Rights Act. We also need to have that equivalent population, more or less, pretty close. Another principle, though, is to have contiguous compact districts. So kind of, as opposed to strange, gerrymandered, odd-looking districts, it'd be nice if they were kind of contiguous and compact. It'd be nice also if they kind of conformed with existing boundaries for cities, counties, townships, the existing boundaries. We have around, I think it's 88,000 or so units of government in this country, including school districts and sewer districts and townships and parishes and counties and cities and villages and all kinds of things, and they all have different boundaries. Gets a little confusing. It'd be nice if some things kind of match the same boundaries so we know where we are. It'd be nice also to be able to preserve communities of interest. Now, communities of interest is a broad term. We might be talking about social, maybe all the Catholics live here and all the Presbyterians live over here. Maybe they have some shared political interests, I don't know. But it'd be nice if they could all be in the same district, right? Cultural kinds of communities of interest, ethnic, economic. So if you divide up a community of interest, okay, what happens? Can you think that through for a second? You kind of make it difficult for them to advance any particular issue or block it if that's what they want to do. So if you have a shared community of interest, whatever that interest is, it makes it easier for them to get a representative that might accurately reflect that community of interest, okay? A couple of other principles, though, that might be involved in redistricting, and those reflect some interests of the, okay, where's my thing going? It died. I don't know what I did. So anyway, the reducing competitiveness happens if you get reinforcement of existing majorities, whatever that is. Doesn't matter what majority you're talking about. If you reinforce or strengthen a majority, then the competitiveness declines. You've probably heard people talk about how we have more safe districts, congressional districts in the country than ever before, and that some people believe is a problem. So the safe districts are a reflection of a reduction of competitiveness. So if you're a Republican, you're running in a mostly Republican district, you're probably going to be able to keep your seat. It's probably pretty safe. Same for Democrats. Don't have any safe seats for Greens, Libertarians, and others. Okay, so legislative process, how does it happen? Well, there's the legislature working on it. I wish I could make this happen. Well, anyway, the deadline is February 21st, 2012. Long time from now. They're actually working on it, proposals and so forth. The governor, however, can veto it. Remember that? So already we're pretty sure that it's going to have to be done by somebody else because that deadline probably won't be met. So the courts are also working on it, okay, already with a special redistricting panel, okay? The result's going to be, and I put this up here this way because we have single-member districts, winner-take-all. That has a lot to do with U.S. politics and the way they work. We don't have proportional, for the most part. We don't have, and certainly not in Minnesota, we don't have proportional representation, we don't have multi-member districts, and we don't have a combination, okay? I forgot, I have one other link there. Thank you. Oh, I forgot to do the wheel, didn't I? Might have to go back and do the wheel just to show you that. It's so cool. What is this one? I don't remember what this one is. Oh, this is these are different plans. If you go to this link, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I actually want to show you a more interesting link in a minute that I forgot to do a little bit ago. You'll see that that's one plan. Christy, if you can click on one of those other things like the House districts, you see the lines there will change. Breathing, there, different lines. Those are the House districts. This would be the Minnesota Senate districts. So all of these lines, this is tough business, even with computers, and very controversial for some. Can we go back to that wheel? I would really like to do that. And I don't have this thing, for some reason, I've done something and it's not working. Okay, so go to the fair, yes, that. So I'm going to show you what big differences can happen if you, when you're drawing lines, okay? So imagine that Democrats are boxes and Republicans are circles, or the other way around, whatever you want. I don't care. So if you can see, we can't make this larger, but if you can sort of go around the circle there, see everything, all those people in that round state there are either boxes or squares, boxes or circles. Okay, got that? And what we're thinking, so pick your favorite. Am I a square or am I a circle? You want your side to win, right? And be stronger, okay? So here's the thing. Click on the first box, Christy. Up there, yeah. So here's one way to draw lines. We're going to be able to have 5 legislators, members of Congress, representing this state. So here's one way to draw those lines. And by drawing the lines, each color represents one member of Congress, or one legislator. And here we've counted up, there it's all fair, one person, one vote. And here the squares win 3 seats, and the circles will have 2 seats in terms of safe seats. So move the choice one thing to the right. Different lines, still the same proportionate number of people in each district, but you'll see, ooh, squares win 4 seats out of 5 here. Circles, not so much. Move it one more to the right. Oh, this is a little more even. The squares only win 2 seats. The circles win 3. And again, oh, look at this. Happy circles. Squares get nothing, okay? Same people, right? And here you have 1 seat for the squares and 4 for the circles. People are staying in the same place. You get 1 person, 1 vote, equal representation for the population. You've just changed the lines a little bit. Makes a big difference in who has control of that legislative body. That's what I wanted to show you this little diagram for, okay? So that's pretty much what I wanted to show you, and we've got 1 panelist so far, right? All right, come on up, and yeah, so. Hi, Mike. Have a seat, and I have a trusty little, so we'll have Mike, who is Executive Director of Common Cause. And I brought a little timer that's preset for 10 minutes and 2 seconds. I don't know why it's got the 2 seconds. But I'd like you to talk for about 10 minutes if you could. Okay. And then we'll see if we have, maybe before I have you talk, let me ask you, do you have any questions from what I just said? All of this stuff. Anything? Nothing? Okay. Yeah. Speakers will be more interesting anyway. So, okay, so.
Anything in particular?
No, it's up to you.
Is this on? Yes. So let me just introduce myself again. My name is Mike Dean. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause Minnesota. Anyone here familiar with Common Cause? A few, great. So for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan government watchdog group. And so we work on trying to make sure that everyone's represented in government and not just the special interests. So we spend a lot of time working on things like campaign finance reform, election reform, but then also I've spent a lot of time over the last year working on redistricting. And so the question is, why does redistricting matter? And I think you got a really good idea of how important this process is. Yet, how many of you actually knew about redistricting before you came tonight? Oh, all right, good. A very well-educated group, which is great. And that's the challenge, is that, and one of my struggles right now is trying to make people more aware of this process. Because right now, the process, I would argue, is flawed and needs to be reformed. And so that's what Common Cause has been working on over the last several years. And there's a few reform ideas out there, but let me talk about a little bit about the problems. And you saw that a little bit in the presentation. So what are some of the problems with the process, do people think? Show of hands. What are some of the problems you think that can exist with redistricting reform? Yeah. Gerrymandering. Does everyone know what gerrymandering is?
I'm sure this, who does not know what gerrymandering is? See, we've got at least a couple, so it doesn't hurt
So
to go.
what is gerrymandering? So it comes from a term. Does anyone ever heard of Elbridge Gerry? So this is where it all started, and I don't remember the exact date. Maybe you can remind us of the exact date. I think it was sometime around the 1820s or so. Elbridge Gerry was the governor of Massachusetts. And at the time, they were going through this redistricting process like they do every 10 years in this country. And as they were drawing the lines, he drew the district in a way that ended up looking a lot like a salamander. And so there's a very famous political cartoon that was created, probably one of the first real political cartoons. And the cartoonist basically created the district and had it look like a giant salamander. And this is when you see a lot of the redistricting maps, these districts can look very oddly shaped. I don't know, did you show any before I got in?
I didn't, I just, yeah, no, I didn't.
There's all sorts of weird shapes that exist out there. There is one that looks like earmuff. They call it the earmuff district. Tom, did you create any funny looking districts this year?
I'm sure we did.
This is Tom Freeman,
Thanks.
the
Glad you
committee
made it.
administrator for redistricting.
Freeway's a little challenging.
Yeah. Once in a decade type construction.
So with redistricting, I mean, this comes from gerrymandering, and so there's lots of problems with that. I also see problems with how the lines are drawn, and really the question is by whom. And so in Minnesota, as you heard, the lines are drawn by legislators. Well, with legislators, they have a huge self-interest in this, in that they run every 2 years or 4 years, depending on what seat they're in, and they can draw the districts in a certain way that protects themselves or pushes out incumbents. So this actually happened to now President Obama. President Obama ran for Congress in 2000. He lived on the south side of Chicago and ran against a congressman named Bobby Rush. During that process, got very close in the primary. It was actually a relatively close election and gave the congressman a pretty good run for his money. So then redistricting happens. And what magically happens? What do you think happened when the new lines came out? There was a new line right around President Obama's house. He was no longer in Congressman Rush's district, just by happenstance. And so this is one of the problems, is that with redistricting, you often have this issue of competition, but you also have it used to protect incumbents, where they're basically pushing incumbents or pushing potential challengers out, or drawing districts in a way that benefit themselves. And you heard a little bit about this problem, and this is about competition. I'd like to have as many competitive districts as possible, because in that type of scenario, then you, the voters, can really make the decisions here. But too often when redistricting lines are drawn, that's not what happens. You create these safe districts. And so the worst example of that really is the state of California, and it has been for decades. In California, they have, I think, 52 members of Congress. How many of those districts do you think were competitive, where basically it was within 8 percentage points? How many of the districts do you think in the whole state of California were competitive in the last election? Guesses? Throw out numbers. 5 out of 52. Other thoughts?
0.
2. 3. Out of 52 congressional races, only 3 were competitive. And what happened, and this is what too often happens, is in the state of California, you had Republicans and Democrats actually agree on something. Now, this day and age, we'd applaud if that ever happened. But when it comes to redistricting, we actually don't like that when it happens, because what they did is they crafted districts that protected incumbents from each of the political parties, both for Congress and for the state legislature. And so over the last decade, we've seen a huge number of non-competitive races or safe seats. And in the end, the voters really aren't making the determinations. It was the legislatures of in 2002 that really sort of made these determinations. And so you as voters can't hold your elected officials accountable.
Mike, I'm going to jump in there, first of all.
But you have to be brief because then I'm going to put you on a 10-minute.
Oh, I didn't know. I thought we were just on open forum. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm doing
Give him
my stump speech.
give him my 20 minutes or
Then I'm gonna-
whatever's
Everybody
needed.
gets 10.
Excuse me.
So that's the problem with the process. It's gerrymandering non-competitive seats. So how do we reform the process? I think it's mainly around changing who draws the lines. I think the ideal way to do this is have an independent commission draw the lines. And that's actually what California has done now this time around. So they passed a reform. The voters of California passed in both 2006 and 2008 a reform that changes the way that the lines are drawn. So it's done by an independent commission that's made up of people from, it's a third Democrats, a third Republicans, and a third non-affiliated. There was actually a proposal that was moving through Minnesota to do that very same thing. It passed the Senate in 2009. It didn't go anywhere in the House. And so we're hoping that that comes back. Because again, if you change who's drawing the lines, we think you'll get a better process in the end. Because the problem with legislators drawing these districts is this self-interest issue. They want to protect themselves. And so too often you have them protecting themselves. So if we have an independent group drawing the lines, they're going to do a much better process for a few reasons. One is they're not going to have this self-interest. And two, when we've seen these independent groups draw the lines, they've also been much more transparent about the process. So they've made sort of these decisions talking about communities of interest and done a really focus in on how are we protecting these communities of interest sort of throughout the state. So with that, why don't I leave a little bit more time for question and answer rather than just continue to go on, and we can have a good dialogue here on sort of what reform looks like, what are the problems, but then also if you have additional questions on how the process works.
Okay. So you took 8 minutes. So I'm going to see if I can set this. Let's start. Oh, come on.
I'd probably want to.
Okay. So now we'll go, and I'm going to give you.
Sure. Like Mike had introduced me, I'm Tom Freeman. I'm a St. John's grad of 2008. Excuse my tardiness. I think that's the first time I've ever been late to a St. John's event in my entire life. So I guess there's a first for everything. I am the committee administrator or the lead staff person for the Minnesota House Redistricting Committee. And I guess I've worked my entire life thus far in campaigns across the state. I've lived in 7 of our 8 congressional districts. I've done campaign work in all 8. I've put over 20,000 miles on my car campaigning for candidates of all different kind of conservative, Republican, moderate stripes. My conservative fellows would tell me I voted and worked for a rhino, and I'm proud of that. I worked for Norm Coleman right out of Republican in name only, not conservative enough. However, what I do now is I was the person drawing the line, as Mike would indicate. Myself, a team of others, including the chair of the committee and some folks with specific geographical information services or a GIS master's degree who could draw you a map of anything you want to look at. I'm sure we have districts that look like earmuffs or some sort of interesting looking thing out there. The fact of the matter is cities are shaped in very odd ways. Annexation laws are something I don't even want to get into with this. Just to cover kind of some bases, we did take public comment, we did take public hearings. The process was somewhat inclusive. I would say that the majority of folks don't know what they're asking for. Every single city, county, township in the entire state of Minnesota thinks the world revolves around them. They think their community should not be split. They think that the map should start in their backyard and should be drawn solely to benefit them. Now, you have to take that in consideration in terms of what we do. I guess, you know, I'd like to save more time to talk about kind of the process and answer questions, see what the students have to say. Redistricting is a process that is like no other. It's once in a decade opportunity. There is a large amount of power, policy initiatives, politics, everything is at stake, as kind of one of the questions was. Just to kind of play devil's advocate, not only because I believe it, but also because Mike's on the other side of me on this. I wrote my senior thesis here bashing a different commission, one that I don't even know if Mike supports, but it's a commission to change how we elect our judges or select our judges. It's a proposal by a Republican governor, Al Quie. I would also wish I could go back in time and write my senior thesis on why I don't support the commission to redraw redistricting lines. There's a lot of inherently, flaws and partisanship and different lenses that come into play in trying to appease people when in reality legislators are responsible through the election process to what they do. With that being said, competitiveness is something that Mike and I and other members of the committee have gone a long road on in terms of determining what does a competitive district look like. Is that something that is a district that has 40% identified Republicans, 40% identified Democrats, and a bunch of independents or a bunch of unknowns? In the state of Minnesota, unlike others, we don't register by party, so that information is hard to come by. What are you going to use? Are you going to use election data that goes back to 2008, 2006? When you talk about presidential turnout versus turnout in the last election, which has significantly declined. I would also argue that our state has some of the most ironic political history given who we've elected, anywhere from Jesse Ventura, Amy Klobuchar. The margins that they win by do not necessarily reflect the entire state as a whole, and there is a strong voting pattern for splitting tickets amongst Republicans, Democrats, independents. I should know that. I lost by 316 votes. So I definitely have seen the ups and downs of that. So what I'm doing now is I'm still the redistricting committee administrator for the next 5 or 6 months, but I'm also the capital investment committee administrator now, so I deal with state-based appropriations that you guys might know more along the lines of earmarks, so fun stuff.
Thank you. I think we've had wonderful brevity from each of the speakers, and now it's your turn. I want you to think about questions to ask because there are lots of questions. I set a lot of the parameters for you out in front, but the hard thing is that they don't all work together in a nice, tidy way. So there are questions to be asked about how to balance these issues. Yeah?
I've actually been to a couple of Draw the Line Minnesota meetings, and the thing that comes up the most is conflict, communities of interest and competition, and they seem to conflict each other a little bit. There's a commission that's for Draw the Line, right? Yep. Did they officially strike competition as one of their criteria, or, because I know that was kind of being talked about during the summer. Could you just kind of clarify that?
Yes, they did. And so just for everyone's note, let me just kind of do a back step here, 2 things. One is where the process is. And so you heard the Republican caucus in the House and the Senate develop maps. Those maps were produced, and then they were vetoed by the governor in May. Now, at any point when the legislature reconvenes its session in January, it could produce another map, but it sounds like Tom's already been reassigned, so that may be...
No. I've just been added
All
responsibilities. Right. We are working on another plan, so it is in the works.
So it's possible that they could still adopt a map here before February 21st. Highly unlikely, though, at this point, because I haven't heard that Tom is actually trying to negotiate with the governor, and so I think we're unlikely to see
He won't sit down with us. It's shocking. I don't know why.
What did you say to him?
I don't know. He
Okay.
vetoed my bill on my
Sorry.
birthday, believe it or
Okay.
not. So it
that's
was
hard.
and he didn't even wrap it in a bow. You know, I don't know why. I don't know what I did.
So the court is currently working on a plan, and they've actually, somebody, in order to have that proceed, somebody actually had to file a lawsuit. And what the lawsuit basically says is, we believe the districts are malapportioned. So meaning that the districts are not equal in population size, and so because of that, the person is arguing that my civil rights are being violated as a result of that. So that's what started the lawsuit, and right now that's in state court. And so they've been going around the state listening to the public on this. But before that even began, there was a group called Draw the Line, which is a few nonprofits, and we tried to develop our own commission to make recommendations on how we think the map should be drawn. So as part of that, there were a series of hearings throughout the summer. And what that group did was it was 15 members just public could apply to be on it, and they were struggling with this issue of the criteria. And that criteria is really so critical in the process, and I think a lot of people don't understand how important it really is. Now, there's certain criteria that you pretty much have to follow because it's in statutes, in the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act, there's federal law around it. But there's other criteria that are a little bit more discretionary. And then there's also how you weight the criteria can have a huge impact. And so there's sort of this natural tension between what's defined as communities of interest and competition. And so what the group ended up deciding is actually leaving competition off. And I think that's fine. Common Cause, speaking now on behalf of just my own organization, we support competition as an idea. I think it's really important because the major criticism we always hear of redistricting is this polarization that happens in the country. There's too many safe districts where voters don't really get to have a say in the process, and it's creating sort of moving the parties to the extremes right now. And just to give you, and the reason that happens is when you have safe districts, the competition often isn't between Democrat and Republican, it's Democrat and far left liberal progressive Democrat, and on the Republican side it's Tea Party versus a Norm Coleman type. And so what you see in those type of races is that the parties move to the extreme, and that's one of the ongoing problems that we see, I would argue, in this country. But in terms of communities of interest, I think they rightly decided that communities of interest is a priority, because really in the redistricting process, you want to assign people of similar interests. And why do you want to do that? So the reason you want is so that an elected official can better advocate for those interests at the legislature. So if I am, let's say, here in St. John's, and this district goes all the way down to St. Cloud, or maybe even you create a district that goes all the way down to the Twin Cities area, there's going to be a lot of different diverse interests. Now, as an elected official, it's going to be really hard for me to represent all those interests. And so what you try to do in the redistricting process is group people together of similar interests so that it's easier to advocate for them. And the whole idea there is then it's easier for the legislator to advocate for those positions, but then the public feels more engaged, like they're actually being responded to. So
Okay, let me tell you,
Okay.
I want to ask you to pause there and see if Tom has a response
No,
to
I
that.
think
Communities of interest
Mike has
a priority.
a definite point that communities of interest has a play in redistricting, and in terms of where these are oftentimes as vague, innocuous kind of terms that redistricting nerds like Mike and myself, we actually think that's a badge of honor to call ourselves that, I think, argue about. Republicans, in terms of where our committee was, and just speaking on behalf of myself, communities of interest is oftentimes, if Mike is trying to protect or produce a map that doesn't produce gerrymandered districts, your communities of interest standard should be very, very defined and should identify what those communities of interest are. What I mean by that is oftentimes you have these things like, for instance, one of the things that's oftentimes most ridiculous in my mind is that the St. Cloud Times newspaper description or subscription list could be used as a community of interest. So because you receive the St. Cloud Times, all of a sudden everybody that receives the St. Cloud Times has got to be of similar cloth. Or that just because Highway 12 goes through a bunch of small cities, that oftentimes means that they just share everything in common. Now, why I'm saying that is that communities of interest standards should be lower or ranked lower, and we did prioritize our principles. And the reason this is
Which
because
of yours ranked higher?
the ones that ranked higher, oftentimes, as Mike indicated, are things that are mandated by statute or mandated by the Constitution. They're things like compactness or contiguity, so I can't take one portion of land, skip a bunch of land, and then grab another one. Everything has to be enclosed in one line. Simple enough, right? Shockingly, that had to be explained to some people. Now,
But that still allows
Tho-
for gerrymandering.
correct. That's not enough, obviously. The things after that become where you place things like city and county and subdivision splits, which if you talk to anybody who's ever run for city council or served on any Tom, Dick, and Harry board that the city has, it is a keen interest to keep as many cities, counties, townships, and municipalities as whole as possible, because that makes government work better, more efficient, and quite honestly causes a lot fewer headaches for people going to the polls. It saves election costs. We had a great testimony from Joe Mansky, who's one of the greatest election officials in the country, Ramsey County elections official who worked on Governor Ventura's commission 10 years ago, indicate that it really does matter for election officials to keep as many cities and counties whole. So for us, when we were creating our plan, that was something we took a lot more seriously than whether or not somebody who subscribes to the Egan Sun Current really was included with their neighbors that also had that subscription that might not be in the city limits of Egan. Now, that's not enough. Yet again, there's other things, as Mike indicated, the Voting Rights Act and minority protection, and making sure that you don't split, for instance, a tribal property, which is an identifiable community of interest. The key is the word identifiable. We had some interesting testimony in our committee with a committee member from Minneapolis who didn't quite understand what the word identifiable meant. But I'm pretty sure if you can identify a community of interest that is a subset of people, that it's going to be pretty clear to you and I what that's going to be. So.
Okay, but that is tricky. Anybody who wants to take poli-sci 222, I'm shameless here. We do talk about how to define things like that. So I'd like to hear some other questions. Yeah, John.
Minnesota has 100% contestation in all state and federal legislature elections.
And that means?
That means not one candidate ran unopposed. So there's always at least one Democrat and one Republican in each election. So why should we change how we run this?
You mean on the federal races? No, we had about 5 or 6 Republicans that didn't have an opponent. Yeah. It's pretty close, though. You are right. It's pretty close.
So does everybody understand what contestation, that means in most races, there is a Democrat running and there is a Republican running, and probably some other folks too, but at least one of each of those.
So the problem with that, though, is that in many of those races, they may be running, but they don't have a chance at all. I mean, they're a sacrificial lamb. And Tom will, I think, even admit to that you see this with Republicans in the urban core. You see this with some Democrats in the rural areas where they just have no shot at all. And so the problem there is that those exist because the way that Democrats and Republicans sort of align, you tend to see some cohesion there and that they sort of kind of group themselves together. What we want to try to do, though, is maximize the number of competitive districts. And in 2002, when Governor Ventura created his redistricting commission, they prioritized that. So they said that we want to try to maximize the number of districts. And they created something like 55 competitive districts when they looked at it. The map that Tom has produced creates a lot less. I think it's something like 30 actually competitive House races when you look at some of the analysis. And so by reducing that number, that means voters have less and less of a say sort of in the political process. And so what I try to do is we want to maximize those numbers. And it is possible. You can draw districts in which you can create that competition. I mean, there wouldn't be so much invested in this if people didn't think it had an impact on the outcome of these elections. I mean, millions and millions of dollars are spent by special interests to influence this. So it clearly has an impact, and so we need to figure out a way to maximize that competition.
Okay, Tom,
I
you
just
want-
respond. First and foremost, Mike's definition of what a competitive district is and what he uses to define a competitive district with his index. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of statistical wonkdom here and why his normalized vote analysis is flawed. But what I will say is people do not choose where they live based on their party alignment. So because I live in Uptown personally, I live in Uptown. I know I look like a hipster doofus to all of you, but that doesn't mean I'm a progressive Democrat who eats granola and shops at Whole Foods all the time. I mean, quite frankly, I'm not saying that. My neighbors might. I don't care. That's not who I am. I'm a Republican. That's the fact of the matter. I choose to live in Uptown because I'm young. My friends live there. That's where I hang out. That's where I want to assimilate. Now, am I going to run for office in Uptown? God, no. However,
why not?
because I have no ambition to run for office, quite honest.
And what kind of a chance would you have to win?
I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to create a safe district, here we are in a scenario in which if you took the 72 districts that are held by Republicans in the House of Representatives right now, divided their populations by the ideal house size, Republicans technically should have 76 seats. Now, am I going to say that we're entitled to those 76 seats? God, no. Because the fact of the matter is, people live where they do. We have the census, it gets switched, and guess what? People's districts that have overpopulation of certain Republicans their districts are going to get weaker because they're going to lose a bunch of people that tend to vote for them. That's just the reality. It's not about partisanship. It's about cities, communities, and citizens and choosing where they live. Now, if you were to take Mike's idea of a safe plan, how are you going to divide stalwart cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, I would even argue Ramsey County and the first-ring suburbs, and Duluth and the Iron Range, and really, you're going to impact those citizens' lives in a negative way. Now, Mike will say, well, I don't mean there because you're right, we can't move the needle there even with my numbers. But the fact of the matter is, you can't move the needle, but you shouldn't be trying to move the needle because in reality, you are disenfranchising people just based on the way they vote, which is a whole different ball of wax.
Okay. Interesting idea to end with there. Questions? Other questions? Yeah. Chase.
Within the different states, I'm from Wisconsin, so I know we've got, I think it's 99 state house and 33 state senate. What's the difference? Do those numbers ever change? Because Wisconsin's got, I think, about 1 million more people than Minnesota, and yet you have nearly, well, 1.5 times the number of seats that we have. How does that number and, or whatever.
Yeah, that's
That's by statute, or no? It's you could do a constitutional amendment, essentially.
No, I think you can do it by statute.
Oh, you can do it.
Yeah.
I learn something every day.
There was a bill this year to shrink it.
the
Okay.
quick answer is that every state defines its own legislative process and the number of legislators and how they're going to be chosen. So that will be a different process from one state to the
It
other.
is
That's sort of-
statutory, because, there was a bunch of Republican members that, given the fact that redistricting was going on, introduced a bill to impact our process based on the fact that they wanted to reduce the size of the legislature, which it didn't get, as you can imagine, didn't get much steam at the legislature. So
It used to be where we actually would not have a fixed number. Before, I think about 1960 or so, they would actually just increase the number of legislative seats as the population of the state increased. They realized that the capital could only fit so many people, and so they had to create a cap on it. In Minnesota, sort of has this philosophy of sort of citizen legislators, where these people are doing this for a part-time job. And so the idea is by keeping the districts smaller, it's easier to represent those people as a citizen legislator. If you look at the opposite of that, look at a state like New Hampshire, they have, I think, like 400 legislators or so. I mean, the districts are really small, but they have this citizen legislator idea like Minnesota. I think we're up there in terms of the number of legislators in our state per capita, but you have other states like California who actually have fewer. I think they have fewer than their congressional seats. So legislative districts are bigger than the congressional districts in that state.
And you also have states like Texas where in Minnesota, we have to have 2 House districts equal a Senate district. In Texas, it's completely opposite, where they literally have 2 separate maps. So Senate lines and House lines don't interact whatsoever. They're 2 separate redistricting bills, something that's a completely interesting process nonetheless.
So twice as much hassle.
And twice as much politicking.
Yeah. No, it's a political process?
Never.
No. Other questions about this? Yeah.
I guess I'm sort of curious
So the way California does is, you're going to test me on the exact numbers, but it's something like a 21-member commission that's been created. And individuals basically apply for the commission. And so I think they had something over like 1,400 applications. This is the first time it ever happened this way too. So they got an increased number as a result of that. And so they kind of have the buckets I described. 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 sort of non-affiliated. And so then they had a group, someone similar to like the Secretary of State, although it wasn't the Secretary of State, sort of go through the applications and sort of they decided sort of who was on that commission. And the commission then started meeting. They started meeting, I think, in April of this year and started drafting a map. And what they did is they had public hearings across the state. I think they had over like 75 public hearings throughout the state of California. And then throughout that process, as they were drawing the map, and this is what I really like, is that they were doing it completely transparently. So people saw them sort of start drawing the maps and putting things together as the process went along. And so people could request the data, sort of what they were considering. And at the end of the day, I think people overwhelmingly have supported it. Now, unfortunately, the Republican Party has come forward and is actually challenging the process in California. And it's largely what you're seeing is it's the party, not Republicans. And what has happened is that, and this too often happens with redistricting, is that the incumbent legislators look at how this impacts them and thus don't like the map. And you see this happening all across this country. You have it on the flip side. Democrats in Wisconsin, they don't like the map there, and so they're complaining about the process. And so they've come up with a map that I think has done a pretty good job, and they really focus on respecting that communities of interest as an idea. And that's what they got through all that public testimony is, where are these communities of interest? And so what you're likely to see is much more competitive elections in the California process coming up in this next election, both on the congressional side and the legislative side.
But I just comment, I mean, I think Mike makes a great point in the sense that this explains one of the inherent flaws with the commission, in the sense that all the commission really is trying to do is replace the work of the legislature, because ultimately, dependent upon which party feels disenfranchised based on election results, whatever, oftentimes they're a placeholder and there's a legal strategy to being the first one to jump in and being the plaintiff in the lawsuit. There is a legal strategy behind that. I don't pretend to be a lawyer. My brother tells me otherwise, but I don't quite understand what the legal strategy is. However, you're going to have a situation where one of the parties is going to jump in and ultimately it still can be solved in court. And this is something that's more in line with the beauty of our system of government, in the sense that there are checks and balances to watch out for this system. And guess what? There still is the opportunity, Mike, that the court panel in California will come back and tell the Republican Party, you know what? The people have spoken. This is the process that the state has approved now, and you don't have grounds to stand on. That may happen. The likelihood of that is that I think it's stronger than some people are willing to admit, because what's going to happen is they're going to have to find some sort of Voting Rights Act claim, some sort of very technical legal claim to attack the map that the commission produced. In order to get their lawsuit approved, because you have to attack something. Now it is passed and signed legislation, if I'm not mistaken. I think the governor signed it, didn't he?
He doesn't have to sign it.
He doesn't have to sign it. So it just goes into law. That's the line. So regardless, that's the law of the land, if you will. And so the burden of proof for the Republican Party in California is very, very defined, I would say.
I want to take a minute to ask a question of somebody who's deep in the political side of it, because you're a Republican, you're working on this process. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of a strategic or tactical calculation. So we, the Republicans in the legislature, have to propose a plan. If we don't get it done, and something that the governor will sign, the court is out there, and they're going to do it in some other way. Is that a constraint right there on the kind of plan, the second plan, that you might come up with? Or is that irrelevant to what you're working on?
Well, I mean, what I'm working on now is hoping that we can actually just get in a room together. I mean, with the Vikings Stadium and with the budget going on, it quite honestly has gone beyond the radar. And I think when my boss approached the minority leader and he basically turned her away, I think they basically said, you know what, quite frankly, were more comfortable going to court. That was what they didn't want to do, and quite frankly, I get it. Hopefully, I get that it's a political process and that Representative Thiessen or Minority Leader Thiessen has the right to say, you know what, let's wait until our map comes out in court, because let's remember, not only did they not produce a plan, they've waited now and critiqued our plan for, it's a known quantity. That's fine. I'm fine with that. I stand by the map. It is what it is. It's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect, but that day will probably come after all parties have shown their map. So that's what kind of that work is now. Now, your real question is kind of what constraints does the looming court battle have on you as a map maker when you're in the room? Yeah. The real question, or the real thing, is that your plan has to not only be ready to go to the House floor, and your chair of the committee not only has to be ready to defend every line that you drew, or that she drew, or he drew, or whoever decided that that was what was going to happen, but the fact of the matter is you have to be ready for court. Now, I have with me a nice little spreadsheet here that Kay's probably looking at, like, what in God's name is that? And quite honestly, it's something that we compared every single day. Every single day that we drew plans, we compared our plans and their basic technical calculations, political subdivision splits, communities of interest splits. Now, these that are identifiable in our software are Minneapolis and St. Paul have city planning districts or neighborhoods. Duluth has that. And so, population range was a big thing. That's one of the biggest things that people go back and forth on is what's the difference between the largest district and the smallest district? Because it is about one person, one vote. As corny as that may seem, I'm not trying to sound like a founding father. That is truly what we're trying to do. So the short answer is you have to be ready for court, because your plan is going to be talked about in a legal standpoint. Whether somebody's representing you or not, your plan's really got to be court ready to some degree.
So are you saying, in effect, that recognizing that what a lot of folks have said from the very beginning is, well, yeah, the courts are going to have to do this. There is this process, but it's all going. Everybody knows it's going to end up in the courts. So at the very least, though, your plan might be at play as the court does its process later on.
Sure, and I think there are certain points or certain parts of our legislative map, and maybe not congressional. Remember that we do both. But for instance, the Iron Range lost 30,000 people if you take the actual identified region that is the Iron Range. Now, they're kept whole. Their representation is kept whole, as is the city of St. Paul. Minneapolis, on the other hand, has what warrants 9.34 House districts. They get 9.4 House districts. Now, that's just the reality of it. So a lot of it comes down to numbers, but at the end of the day, you're not assuming you're going to court, but you need to be prepared for that, because somebody is going to file a lawsuit against you, whether you like it or not. Somebody's not going to be happy. That's inevitable. So why not prepare for it?
Questions? Do you want to add anything to that? Any other questions for this? Yeah. John, you want to go again?
Congressional districts have zero deviation. So literally courts have thrown out plans that are, the deviation or the difference between districts are 13 people. I kid you not. So literally, I can go in, look at what's called a census block, which literally goes down to, there are blocks that are 0 people, and the things that define blocks oftentimes are roads, bridges, they can be a power line, they can be a ditch, they could be literally they could be, it could be the Watab Bridge that is a line that cuts across 94, believe it or not. But you have to get down to one person, one vote. So right now, the proposed district size is 662,991 people. okay? Now, the state, obviously, you cannot divide a person into eighths. I can't do that. So there are 3 districts, there are 3 people that, or districts that will vary by 3 people. Ideally, you would want districts to be off by 1 person, and there'll be 3 districts, which we had, that were off by 1 person. So there are 3 districts that are 662,990 people. That's why in certain instances, like in Coon Rapids right now, your 1 precinct is in with the 6th congressional district. Now, I would also argue that, and this is something that maybe Mike wants to add, I don't know, this is my personal belief, but ultimately the goal of any map maker should be to split only 7 counties and 7 cities between 8 districts, because you should only be splitting counties and cities between districts once. That would be the logical claim. Now, I would also go farther to say that you should be splitting populous areas that can withstand such a split, i.e. St. Cloud. St. Cloud's in 3 counties. It's the only city like that in the state. And it's a it's a, I wouldn't call it a metropolitan area, but it's a regional hub that could, well, maybe it's metro for you guys. Traffic's not that bad down 15, trust me. But, you know, it can withstand that kind of split. There's other things in congressional standpoint, like Ramsey County has been within its own congressional district since its creation. Something that's pretty, you know, ironed down in history that should remain that way. And we did that, unlike the Republicans 10 years ago, which tried to put Minneapolis and St. Paul together in 1 congressional district. That was, I don't support that idea. Nobody on our committee supported that idea. We thought it was ludicrous and didn't want to do it. So maybe Mike can add some bit to that.
I do want you to be able to respond to that, but I also want you to say a bit, if you can, about whether software and technology has made the task of a commission or any other body easier or more complicated.
I think it's probably made it easier for them to actually develop a map. I think it's become more problematic for the public because it's created more opportunities to unfortunately manipulate the process to a group's own political advantage. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing right now, I think, throughout the process. And so they're able to take all this different data. And I'd love to hear Tom talk about all the data that they used. Because that's one question mark I have, and I think a lot of people have, is, you know, what data did you actually use when you drew the process? Because this is one of the challenges, is that it's not very transparent when folks are drawing the maps. And why I really support the idea of that independent commission is because that will force sort of greater transparency in the process. When legislators do it, it's largely done behind closed doors. But I just want to step back and talk a little bit about how important it is for you to be engaged in this process. Unfortunately, there's not much time, but there's still an opportunity. And you know, I think a lot of folks are frustrated with how government is working right now. You see that in some of these protests, but I think you see this in all the public opinion polling. People are frustrated with government, and I think the foundation of that really is our elected officials. And so if you really want to try to fix government, you want to fix some of the problems that it has right now, we really have to address this redistricting problem first, because it's about how communities and how you're represented. And so we can focus on, you know, cities and counties and saying they need to be kept whole, and I think that's important. But there's also, people don't necessarily in the same city or same county don't all identify with the same issues. And so look at some counties that sort of split the suburban and sort of rural areas. Doesn't really make sense for a district to incorporate both rural and suburban interests. Does a soccer mom have the same interests as a farmer? No. And so that's really why this whole concept of communities of interest is really critical. Yes, it can be difficult to define, but it's so critical to ensuring that you have effective representation. And so one of the things that you can do, and I would encourage you to do, is you can send an email to the court defining your community of interest. Now, it could be here on campus. That could be your community of interest. It may be back home. But talk about sort of your community of interest. You know, for example, I live in St. Paul. And so my neighborhood, which is sort of a 4 square mile area, is currently, I would argue, not very well represented in the map that Tom produced. And so there's problems with that. And so what I'm doing is I'm writing the court and saying, here's my community of interest. this community affiliates itself with these other communities in the area. And that helps the court sort of be engaged in this process and draw maps that sort of that make sense. And so I think it's so critical that you do that. Then the second piece that you can do to get involved, that's draw your own map. And so we go to the technology side, where we've actually created a tool that allows all of you to draw your own map. And so I challenge you, draw a better map than Tom. And you'll find out how difficult it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to give Tom credit for that. This process is extremely difficult. It's extremely challenging. And it's partially because Minnesota has so many legislative districts. I mean, to draw 201 districts is not an easy task at all. It's much easier to do congressional lines. Yeah. But sit down and draw a district. You get a better idea of how this whole process works. And so we have a website called drawminnesota.org. We've actually extended our deadline. We've had over 150 people start drawing lines, over 400 maps. But sit down and draw your own map, congressional, legislative. And with that, we actually have a contest. So you can actually win cash prizes. The winner gets $1,000 for drawing the best legislative map. So it's not a small chunk of change either. And so the deadline for that is November 11th at 5 o'clock, and just go on the website, you log in, and you can start drawing a map.
I just want to know, am I eligible for that?
No, you're not.
I didn't think I was.
Are there any other questions? If not, I want to give our speakers a final couple minutes to close. But I want to make sure we've dealt with questions you might have. Justin, do you have another one? No? Okay. Anybody else? Okay, I like the commercial we had over here. Do we have a commercial over here?
Sure. Yeah. I don't think these are working anymore. So there it is. There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just close by saying I completely agree that you all should take a chance to, maybe we can make it a homework assignment throughout the entire political science department in honor of me. Because it is truly very, very difficult. It is what one might seem as somewhat of a Rubik's Cube, that you really do not understand what drawing one line in southwest Minnesota is really going to do to communities in Albert Lee or Mankato. I mean, this is truly something that one move impacts 16 moves down the road. It's a chess game like no other. So I would interest you in doing that, and I would interest you in truly submitting what you define as your community. The court deserves to hear from you, as do the legislators. I mean, part of something that we're looking forward to is hopefully seeing that, and Mike pushed for this with our committee. He pushed me to do this. I think I did an okay job of putting everything we received online and every testimony we received online. But we want to see also what citizens had to say, so that when we do go back to the drawing table, we can think of other ideas. I know that I've checked every single one of the maps that have been on Mike's system. I think it was great. It's fun. It's something that I geek out to every day, as corny as that may seem. But I will urge you to stay involved with what redistricting is for the future as well, because going forward, I will say the largest hurdle that anybody has who's doing this from a legislative commission, any sort of process standpoint, is truly getting the public engaged in understanding what redistricting is. Oftentimes people just think it's, gerrymandering and, messing around with incumbents districts, and quite frankly, there's a lot more that goes into it, and it's really, and Mike's not this way. Mike is a very respectful, hardworking individual that does not make my life very hard. He's got clear questions, and we disagree, but we're very civil about it. But the public deserves to know that this is a much better, or there are a lot more binding my hands than one would imagine. This isn't a 12-second spot in The Simpsons. This isn't something to make political culture jokes about. This is reality that impacts lives, and ultimately your involvement in the future will produce some sort of process that I think Mike and I both can agree on should improve, and there should be some reforms from a statutory standpoint that could make future redistrictings be less bloody, more streamlined. And some of those things that I would argue, and Mike can respond to this, is quite frankly identifying in statute redistricting principles permanently. I know that there are several folks of the committee, both Democrats and Republicans, that are looking at that in the interim, that are looking to make permanent statutory changes and not leaving it up to each decade redistricting majority party to decide. And quite frankly, if you bind the hands of future redistricting committees with those principles, they're going to have to live up to that. And that's something that the state should support, that I think Mike would support as a good first step. Probably would say that we still need the commission and that he wants to see more reforms, but I think he could agree with me that that is the first important step in making redistricting appear to be more transparent and appear to be headed in the right direction as much as possible. So I'll close with one little note that I am a Johnny. You are in a great institution. St. John's and St. Ben's has done a lot for my future. I wouldn't have a future if it wasn't for John Taylor and other folks here at the campus. And so just as a cheesy side note, truly enjoy your time here. I wish I was here right now, and I wish I was going to Sal's tomorrow night and watching football on Saturday, even if they were to lose yet again. So thank you.
Oh, it's hard to top that. So thank you all for coming.
All right. So I just want to sort of close with a quick quote. So this is a quote, and let me have you guess who actually said it. It says, "Our government would be more productive and our politics more civilized if congressional districts were drawn by panels of nonpartisan elders instead of partisan state legislatures. This would make for competitive general elections and less polarized Congress. Making the change would require politicians to give up their power, never an easy task." Who do you think said that? Any guesses?
Can I guess?
Yes, go ahead.
Ronald Reagan?
Nope.
President Obama.
Nope.
It's in your video. What did you say?
Nope. George W. Bush.
It's in that video, isn't it?
And this has been presidents actually since John F. Kennedy have admitted that this is a problem. Redistricting is a problem that plagues our country. And so it's really going to be incumbent upon you to sort of help fix that. There's many different solutions, some of which I've outlined tonight, some which President Bush support. There's other ideas that Tom talked about. And so I think the most critical piece is, one, we need to move forward with reform, especially here in Minnesota, because 4 of the last 5 redistricting processes have not gone through the legislature. The legislature has failed to do their job. So they have a batting average of 200. Now, that maybe is good enough to play for the Twins. It's not good enough to make it to the World Series. And so we really need to fix this process. And unfortunately, it looks like we're going to fail again this time. And so I think some of the ways, and so it really is incumbent upon you to get more engaged in the political process. And government isn't just sort of this entity. Government is you. You have the ability to impact this process. And so this time around, the court gave you that opportunity by offering public comment. But sit down and draw a map, get involved, and that's how you can make this democracy a better place to work and make sure it's more representative of you.
I totally agree, but be sure to do your homework first. All right. Thanks for coming.